Good morning, everybody. My name is Reed Broughton. I'm the Montgomery County Chamber of Commerce 2025 Chair. And on behalf of the entire Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you to our August Eggs and Issues. Today, we have the opportunity to hear from Tom Barkin, the President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. Out of respect for our panel, we ask that during today's program, attendees, if able, stand when providing a question. Opportunities for questions will be available toward the end of the program. We want to give a special thank you to the sponsor of today's program, Freedom First Credit Union. Please give them a round of applause. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Robert Natt with Freedom First Credit Union. Robert serves as the Vice President of Public Affairs and Community Development.
Good morning, and thank you, Reed. It's a pleasure joining you here this morning. This is my first Eggs and Issues, so it's great to be present. Again, my name is Robert Natt. I serve as Vice President of Public Affairs and Community Development. I came to Freedom First after previously serving at the Roanoke Valley Allegheny Regional Commission. There I led a program addressing addiction and mental health, building a recovery ecosystem across 11 localities and about 175 organizations. So in many ways, my role at Freedom First is continuing this same effort in fostering and promoting regional partnership and collaboration for local impact and opportunity. All right. Freedom First is a not-for-profit, member-owned cooperative. It's led by a volunteer board of directors and serving over 69,000 members across Southwest and Central Virginia. We're certified as a community development financial institution and also maintain a low-income designation, meaning we serve some of the most vulnerable all the way through the most affluent members of our communities. Our commitment to local community reinvestment is central to our mission. Now, most financial institutions, of course, measure their worth and value by how much money they keep. Of course, we track those metrics as well, but we also measure by how much we give back. Our mission is helping people prosper, helping communities thrive. We do this through some incredible impact banking programs. And if there's anything I want you to remember about Freedom First is when you bank with us, your deposits stay local and they are deployed locally as well. I know you're all familiar with financial institutions, so I will keep this very brief, but we offer a full range of services, full banking suite, as well as specialized services in community development, private banking, mortgage lending, commercial, and wealth. We have a broad range of consumer and business accounts. In our field of membership, this is unique to credit unions, we have a defined field of membership. So ours is a geographic area, community-based charter, and anyone who lives in this region, lives, works, worships, or studies, would be eligible to open an account and a membership with us. And of course, I would invite you to do so. I'd like to share a little bit about our community impact. It's a huge part of what we do is giving back to the community. Last year, that was over $326,000, and give back to local nonprofits, students, and other community causes. We prioritize volunteerism among our employees, which was logged over 2,000 hours of employee volunteerism last year. This is a really cool one as well. We have a financial empowerment center where we offer no-cost financial counseling sessions. Last year, this was over 1,200 sessions provided, and the results of that were over $2 million in non-mortgage debt reduction and an increase in savings of nearly $34,000 for those participants. This is maybe the most fun job at Freedom First. This is Kaylin. And she drives our ice cream truck, which is called Scoop. Feels weird to talk about ice cream at 8 in the morning. And last year we donated almost, over 16,000 free ice cream treats. This brings a lot of smiles to children and community members all across the region. We also have a program called Play for Purpose. This is with Virginia Tech. At home games, when Virginia Tech converts for a first down, we donate $100 for each first down conversion to local nonprofit organizations. This was nearly $30,000 in donations last year for local schools and nonprofits in the New River Valley. We have an advisory board. Are there any members present of our advisory board in the New River Valley? I see at least one, Kevin Bird, who also serves on our board of directors. And I'd also like to introduce a few members of our team. If you're here this morning, would you please stand just briefly so we can make connections here? Excellent. Good morning. Thank you. So lastly, this is a link to our website. Please keep in touch. Love to meet anyone and everyone here, and please reach out to our team as well. So now I have the pleasure to introduce Tom Barkin. Tom is the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. He has held this position since 2018. Tom serves on the Fed's chief monetary policy body, the Federal Open Market Committee, and is also responsible for the Richmond Fed's bank supervision and the Federal Reserve's technology organization. He is on the ground continually in the 5th District, which covers South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, DC, West Virginia, and Maryland. His engagement in the region has brought real attention to areas facing economic challenges. Please welcome Tom to the podium.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Am I on? Am I on now? No?
Nope. If you don't mind,
I
we'll
can do
fix
this.
that. All right.
Good morning. I guess what I had to say wasn't all that important. Well, it's great to be back here with you. I don't know if I could count how many eggs and breakfasts I've done, 3 or 4, I think. There's been a lot of Fed news in the paper, including this morning, so I'm looking forward to not talking about much of it. We have a beautiful building, for those of you who drive up 95, right on the James River in Richmond. It's quite literally a 24-story ivory tower. And I told my board when I got hired that I couldn't really learn about the economy from there. The place to learn about it was here, with people who are actually building things, making things, and selling things. And so I thought what I might do today is talk a little bit about what I think about the economy, just to set it up. But I'm really interested in what you think. And so we're going to have a lot of time for Q&A. And so please tell me where I get it wrong, and any advice you have on what we're doing. These, of course, thoughts are going to be mine and not that of anybody else in the Federal Reserve System. Okay, so for the last several months, what I've been saying is it's really hard to drive when it's foggy. And what I mean by that is, there's been so much uncertainty that if you're the guy in the car running a business, it's hard to commit to put your foot on the gas. You don't know what lies around the next curve. It's also been hard to put your foot on the brakes. You don't know what's going to crash into you. And so the only rational strategy for most of us has been to pull over and put on the hazards and wait for more clarity. And this hesitation, which is also present among consumers, seems to me to have quieted the economy's momentum. If you look at the first half of the year, GDP growth slowed to 1.5%, 1.2%. That's down from almost half from 2.5% last year. Job gains have also slowed. The 3-month average is now down to 35,000 jobs gained per month, which is less than a third of the 127,000 we gained in the first quarter of this year. But I have to say, I think the fog is lifting. The tax bill has passed. Net immigration, we now know, is clearly down. Deregulation is underway. Tariff deals are being nailed down. For those of you who are interested, Taylor Swift has released the date of her upcoming album. And as a result of all of these things, business, consumer, and market sentiment have all started to rebound. So what is all this going to mean for the broader economy? I want to make the case that it all really lies in the feet of the consumer. And I'll talk about that. So for several years now, you've been hearing call after call that says we're going to have a recession. In fact, I looked at my notes, I was here 2 years ago, and the entire speech was about, are we going to have a recession? We keep predicting a recession, and yet that recession hasn't come. And why is that? I think we have the American consumer to thank. Consumer spending makes up nearly 70% of GDP. It's been remarkably resilient, weathering the pandemic, weathering inflation, and weathering interest rate hikes. Now, that's not to say that consumer behavior has stayed constant. Consumers are exhausted from 4 years of above target inflation. They're tired of high prices, and we definitely see consumers trading down. They're continuing to spend, I want to be clear about that, but they've moved from beef to chicken, from higher price retailers to value retailers, from brand names to private labels, from vacations to staycations. So the overall level of spending has stayed solid, but you're seeing real changes in the mix. And for those of you who took economics in college, you might call this price elasticity in action. And I think these consumer choices have been key to bring inflation down. Now, if the economy were to falter, in all likelihood, you'd need consumer spending to pull back more fundamentally. And recently, I talked about the numbers for the first half of the year. In the context of this high uncertainty, we've seen consumer spending soften. Real consumer spending has all but stalled in the last few months. But I have to say, I take comfort in the underlying dynamics. People have jobs, real wages are up, asset values are still high. It's just hard for me to imagine a sustained consumer pullback as long as those conditions stay in place. People have jobs, wages are up, asset values are high. So what does a solid but stretched consumer mean in the context of the road ahead? So I anticipate the ride's going to be bumpy, but bearable. And I'm going to try to talk about this in the context of the Fed's dual mandate, which is stable prices and maximum employment. So let me start with price stability. 12-month core inflation is now 2.8%. That remains above the Fed's 2% target for overall inflation. And companies are likely to raise prices further in the context of increased tariffs. Current policy has raised the average tariff rate to over 17%, and customs collections are already nearly 9%. But I think this is important to emphasize, we're not in 2022 anymore. If you think back to 2022, when we saw inflation balloon, you saw a Fed's policy that was pretty accommodative. But beyond that, remember that consumers were flush with cash due to pandemic stimulus, suppressed spending during the pandemic, higher wages, and frothy asset markets. Consumers didn't let price increases hinder their revenge spending. And that's what fueled inflation. And I'll just go back to where I started, which is that's just not where consumers are in 2025. They feel stretched, particularly those with low and moderate incomes. They're more willing to defer purchases if prices go up. And should they feel forced to accept price increases for products you just have to have, I anticipate you'll forego spending for others. We may already be seeing that dynamic. Amidst all the talk of tariffs and higher goods prices to come, we've seen people stock up on iPhones and cut back on services like air travel and lodging. If we see this kind of demand destruction more broadly, then the inflationary impact of tariffs would be a lot less than many anticipate. So that then brings us to the topic of employment. If consumers draw a line when they're faced with higher prices, businesses will see volumes drop and margins squeezed. If they do, they'll look for costs to cut. And if you're looking for costs to cut, employment's at risk of taking a hit as a result, especially given the availability of new technologies that save labor, such as AI. That could start a vicious cycle. I told you that if people having jobs was an important part of consumer spending staying solid. If people lose their jobs, workers could pull back even further on spending. To be clear, that has not happened to date. For the last year or two, we've been seeing businesses in what I've been calling a low hiring, low firing mode. That's an unusual, but it's a stable labor market. Unemployment remains low at 4.2%. That's near most estimates of maximum employment. And unemployment has only been as low as 4.2% since 1970, in 1999 and 2000, in 2019, and in 2022. So just in the last 55 years, the only 3 times you've had unemployment that low have been those years. Why is that? Well, I think businesses that found themselves short during the pandemic don't want to take the risk of recurrence. So they're still paying year-over-year compensation increases above pre-pandemic levels. And layoffs, as evidenced by initial unemployment claims and layoff announcements, are low on a historical basis. I said the job gains have slowed recently, which is certainly worth watching. But I'm hopeful that even as businesses face costs and price pressure, they'll largely avoid the kind of large layoffs that would spike unemployment and lead to consumer pullback. I think the story with businesses is very similar to the story with consumers, which is how you come into this moment matters. I talked about consumers being exhausted by high prices. That's going to put a lid on inflation. I think firms are already running lean. If you've been slow rolling hiring for years in anticipation of recession that hasn't come, downsizing with attrition, then you're already light staff. So even should demand falter, you're going to be lean enough, you're not going to have the kind of big reductions that we've seen in the past. So I think any coming increase in the unemployment rate may also well be less than most anticipate. And that's reinforced by the reality that the labor force is not going to continue to grow at the rate that we've gotten accustomed to. Border crossings have plummeted. We probably have about 2 million fewer immigrants than we had just a year or two ago. Hundreds of thousands are expected to lose temporary protected status. And my generation, the baby boomers, continues to age. I want to be clear, I'm not aging, but they are. And just as a stat, over the past 3 years, the number of people over 65 out of the labor force has increased by 1.3 million a year. So while there may be fewer jobs, there may also be fewer people trying to get jobs. I think this is all going to be hard to interpret over the next several months because I think the data is going to be hard to interpret. If we have an elevated inflation rate, what part of that is due to tariffs, which may just be a one-time impact, versus increases in underlying inflation? If we have reduced job gains, how do you interpret those, given that the unemployment rate may well stay stable and the denominator may well be decreasing? And given that fewer workers also means fewer spenders, how do you interpret lower GDP should the labor force remain in relative balance? So as I said, if the road ahead remains bumpy, fasten your seatbelts. Before I break, just a couple comments on monetary policy. You may have seen at our July meeting with the labor market near most estimates of maximum employment and inflation above target, the FOMC continued to hold the Fed funds rate steady at a moderately restrictive level. We may well see pressure on inflation. We may also see pressure on unemployment. The balance between the two is still unclear. As the visibility continues to improve, we're well positioned to adjust our policy stance as needed. So with that, maybe I'll open up to questions, advice, comments. Curious what's on your minds. Yeah.
You mentioned the resiliency of consumer spending and helping maintain the economy. With that being said, I've heard consumer debt. How do we think about how much of this is being fueled by debt and how sustainable that is over the longer term?
So consumer debt's really interesting. If you go back to 2007, 2008, consumers were extremely highly leveraged. Coming out of the Great Recession, they deleveraged at significant scale. So consumer debt is actually quite low compared to where it was 20 years ago. The challenge one gets into is numbers versus ratios. So overall consumer debt level, particularly credit card debt, is up, and it's up to new dollar highs. But as a share of spending or as a share of GDP, it's not. Now, there are, of course, some people who are stretched. So I'm giving you aggregate numbers. There are definitely lower income, moderate income people who've been financing their lifestyle through credit card debt or buy now, pay later. And we are seeing a tick up in credit card delinquencies. But I think it's really interesting to reflect on the numbers versus '08 because percent of the economy, what you see is bank debt, way down. Banks are far less levered. Consumer debt, way down. Consumers are far less levered. Government debt, way up. And corporate debt is also up as a percent of the economy. So it's just been a very big shift. Yeah?
You mentioned uncertainty, and we've heard a lot about uncertainty in the last few months. Isn't uncertainty just part of life? I mean, the future is uncertain, right? If you know somebody who can consistently predict the future, I want to hire him as my financial advisor. Isn't uncertainty just, that's life?
So Jesse's making a case that if you're a consumer, you should spend, and if you're a business, you should invest and hire. And I'd be very supportive of that. That's all true. And so I'm not suggesting in any objective way that inflation is, that uncertainty is or isn't high. What I am saying is that business investment has come off and business hiring has come off. And when you ask the businesses why they're not hiring or why they're not investing, they would say uncertainty. So that's, what I'm saying. On the consumer side, consumer sentiment has been way down over the last 6 months. It's been rebounding over the last 3. I think that's more about inflation expectations. It turns out that consumers don't like inflation at all. And when they start thinking you're going to have future inflation, if you look at those surveys, that sentiment comes down. So that's the sentiment. But I think, to the extent that businesses and consumers feel enough confidence that they move forward and spend, invest, and hire, that is in fact where the economy goes. And there's a good book which came out about 15 years entitled Animal Spirits, which sort of talks about that there's this sort of animal spirit in the economy. And when things get aligned and people are moving forward, it tends to work. And then there's also the opposite. Yeah?
So you mentioned a little bit about the economy slowing. We're down to 1.2% GDP. Like 15 years ago, that number would have been a bigger headline. There would have been a lot of talk about, hey, we're approaching stall speed. What's the Federal Reserve going to do about it? Are they concerned about us slipping into recession? Has that changed? Has the way the Fed thinks about economic growth changed?
So an interesting question to ask is, what would normal growth be? What would normal growth be in an economy? And many of us remember the 90s, where the economy grew at about 3 or 3.5% a year as normal growth. One way to think about normal growth is it's a combination of 2 things, which is growth in the workforce times growth in productivity. Okay, and in the 90s, we had workforce growth of about 1.5%, 2% a year, and we had productivity growth of about 2.5% a year. And so how you got to 3.5 was 1.5 to 2 plus 2 plus 2.5 kind of got you to 3.5 or even higher. Workforce growth has come down steadily over the last 30 years. Part of that has been, a big part of that has been the demographics, where my generation's retired and fertility is not kept up. And so right now, without immigration, workforce growth is basically 0. Immigration in the 2010s kind of contributed almost 3/4 of a point. So we sort of had workforce growth in the 0.75, and even in 23 it was almost 1. Now with immigration down, I think you should assume that the workforce growth part of this is relatively flat, which means you're then betting on productivity. And we had a lot of productivity in the 90s, like I said, 2.5. That came down to almost 1% in the 2010s. In the last 3 years, it's actually come back nicely. It's sort of in the 1.5 to 2% range. And so flat workforce growth, 1.5 to 2%, productivity growth, that gets you in the high 1s as sort of normal growth. And so 1.2 doesn't look all that bad in that context. 1.2 would look terrible if you thought the trend was 3 or 3.5. Do you see what I mean? And so that's the challenge. There's some of you out here, and I'm among you, who would say, hey, why just 1.5% productivity growth? Why don't we get 2.5 or 3? We've got artificial intelligence, we've got all these automation, robots, and that's possible. We haven't done it in 30 years, but it's certainly possible. And then there's others who would argue the downside on productivity. I don't think the workforce growth number is going to move very much. I mean, fertility's baked, demographics are baked. Hopefully we can get more people in from the sidelines into the workforce. That would be great. Immigration, I think, is largely baked for this period of time. So, I'm not sure that the workforce is the lever. I think the productivity would be the lever. But again, we haven't done 3% productivity growth over any kind of sustained period in our lifetimes. And so to get bigger numbers, you've really got to hit the productivity. And I think now you're talking about a technologically enabled run, which maybe we're on.
wondering what you're seeing in Virginia, as the purpose of tariffs was to bring more manufacturing domestically, and certainly Virginia is largely a service-based economy. Are we seeing manufacturing impacts, or is it too early to tell yet?
Well, so the Virginia economy obviously has two big parts. There's the Northern Virginia part and the rest of Virginia part. The Northern Virginia part is not a manufacturing center. It is a data center, and it is a government center. And so the government part of Northern Virginia is off. The data center part is booming. And then the Southern Virginia part is more of a manufacturing part. So I'll start with that on Virginia. On the manufacturing side, I think it's too early to declare, victory or defeat on that. I do think you're seeing a lot of companies, as they try to navigate the tariffs in particular, trying to manage the question of how do I optimize my supply chain here. You see a lot of foreign manufacturers in particular saying, I've got to better increase my domestic supply, produce local for local, because the sort of globalization thing is going to have a hard time working. When you talk to them about, okay, so what are you going to do actually, the biggest concern they have is workforce. And it gets back to the workforce growth thing that I talked about earlier. They just don't know how they're going to be able to get and afford a capable quality manufacturing workforce in Virginia, North Carolina, and anywhere. And so I think those states that are going to have the best chance of attracting those manufacturers are the states that have a story to tell on workforce. And here in my district, North and South Carolina are growing their workforce 2% a year. Virginia's flat. Maryland, West Virginia, DC are down. And so I'm definitely seeing more activity in the places that are growing workforce than the places that are not growing workforce. But when you talk to manufacturers, they're looking at it. They're hesitant because you got cost issues and what will the tariff rates actually be in time and how long will they last. But the real constraint, it seems to me, is workforce. And I think that's just a hugely valuable place if we can invest there. Yeah?
What sector of the workforce are you seeing the most growth?
The most?
Growth or decline?
Well, so there's no question that the place that is tightest are the skilled trades. So construction workers, carpenters, plumbers, welders. I would put nurses in that, as a skilled trade. Truck drivers, bus drivers, all of that kind of thing. The demand is still very high. It seems very unlikely to be replaced by AI, and the staff is short. The second place that you see a lot of shortage are the care professions. Elder care, child care, nurses, I guess I should have mentioned in that thing. And, that's a place where, those jobs kind of got exposed during COVID as not that safe or not that attractive. And a lot of other jobs that folks in those people could do raised their compensation, and people in those professions couldn't raise their compensation. Teachers are another place like that. And so less compensation, other places making more, people making other choices. They've just been short. So those are the two places that are short. The places I think most at risk are, I'll call it the commodity staff jobs that could be replaced by technology. And where we're definitely seeing that is new college graduates. And you know how it is, your average new college graduate, forgive me, I have one, they don't know anything. But you teach them, and you bring them in, you put them on tasks for a while, and then they learn and they become highly productive. And a lot of institutions, it seems to me, have not been hiring and sort of saying, well, we're not going to lay people off because of AI, but this new staff job, let's just see if we can't, get by for a while and leverage technology. And so that's the segment that's having the hardest placement time, is the new, less skilled, not trade enabled, college graduate. That's the part. Yeah, that was others. Yeah.
You talked about the 5th district being pretty big. It goes from Maryland to South Carolina to West Virginia. There's a lot of different economies in there. There's the Charlotte and Raleigh economies, and then there's rural parts of the economy. You've got to make a lot of decisions on how to navigate that. How do you balance the urban areas and rural areas when you're doing your decision making?
So, we like to think we make lots of decisions, but in the end, we either raise the interest rate 25 basis points, or we lower it 25 basis points, and that affects everybody. And so it's not like, you're in a rural market, we're going to change your interest rate, But But one thing I'm very committed to is making sure I'm not just listening to urban markets or not just listening to rural markets. And so this week, for example, I was in Floyd yesterday. I'm here. I'm going to Patrick County tonight. I'm in Greensboro tomorrow. I'm in West Virginia on Thursday and Friday. And so I'm making sure I'm not just listening to what people say in Richmond or what people say in DC or Charlotte or Raleigh, but also in all kinds of different markets. And I think you do hear a very different economy in smaller towns than you do in bigger cities. The labor market is tighter in most small towns than it is in the bigger cities. And that goes to the question we were just talking about, the skills of the people who are fits for the jobs that exist. I was in Floyd yesterday. Floyd has a big tourism economy. And to the extent, as I said, people are going from vacations to staycations and traffic's down on the Blue Ridge Parkway, you're going to see less business there. And you sort of see that. Also heard that in Myrtle Beach when I was there a little bit ago. And so, again, you understand the economy a lot better if you're on the ground. And my team knows this. I force myself into the broad range of markets. I actually ask myself, am I in every state? Am I in the wide range of cities? Am I listening to? And I think that's just a discipline that helps you understand the whole economy. Yeah.
Some of the, I guess, the smart financial folks that I read here talk about, hey, if interest rates drop, the fear is that the long term of the curve is not going to come down commensurately. That just because of the way the market forces are, that's going to stay stubbornly high. And I know in the past, the Fed, the Treasury, I guess it's more the Treasury role, has taken, borrow from the short term to buy long-term bonds. Is that something that is still in the toolbox necessarily? Well, first of all, what do you think about the idea that, hey, short-term interest rates come down, what kind of impact that's going to have on longer-term rates? And then also, are there things that can be done if that in fact comes to pass?
Yeah, so a reminder for everybody that when I talk to most people about the Fed and the interest rates, people go, great, I'd really like my mortgage rate to come down. The mortgage rate's a 30-year rate, and what the Fed controls is an overnight rate. Okay, so we have absolute and complete control over the overnight rate. So if you want to borrow money for a day, that's what the rate. And for those of you who want to do that. And then, so as evidence of this, back in September of last year, into November and December, we lowered the overnight rate by 100 basis points. It was a little over 5, and we lowered it to a little over 4. And during that time, the long rate actually went up, not down. So we control short term, we don't control long term. And then you might ask, well, what controls long term? And there are 2 or 3 things that go into long term. Inflation expectations matter a lot for the long term. If people think we're going to have a lot of inflation, they're going to demand more money to do it. Some sense of what the Fed's rate path over a 20 or 30-year period controls the long term, but who knows, right? I don't know. And if I don't know, then they don't know. But I just make the argument the biggest thing that controls the long term is supply and demand, right? And supply of treasuries, right? That's going up. Government's running deficits. That means more long-term treasuries are in the market. Supply is going up. And demand, it may or may not be going down, but it's probably not going up the way it used to. The biggest thing, which most people don't talk about, is 30% of the treasuries are held by, foreigners, right? And 2 years ago, whether you're in Japan or Germany, your local alternative bond paid a negative yield. In other words, you wanted to put $1 million into a bond, you had to pay money to do that. And the US has always had a positive yield. And so 2 years ago, a lot of people said, well, I don't like the idea of a certain negative yield. I'd rather take my shot, and maybe currency will go the wrong way, but I'll take my shot in the US. Well, now they're paying positive yields. And so you take a lot less risk in your own country. And then who knows whether they've decided they, want to invest in other places for geopolitical reasons. But I just make the point, supply and demand matters for the long term. And supply and demand has been driving the long yields up, even as we've taken the short yield down. So, inflation expectations, that's another thing. You just have to watch it. But we don't control that. I should make one other point, which is, and these numbers aren't precisely right, but if you look at the 250-year history of this country, the 30-year Treasury has been under, I think it's 4%, maybe 20 years out of 250. Most of those years have been in the last 25 years, but it's not clear to me that a 4.9% 30-year Treasury is out of the norm of the history of the country. In fact, it's a lot like what it looked like in 2005. In terms of tools to do something about the long, well, you know, if the economy were to go into a deep recession, the Fed has certainly done quantitative easing in the past and retains that tool if you wanted to. Quantitative easing is buying bonds to try to, you know, buy down the longer rates. I guess Jay didn't want me talking about that. No. I'm looking for my
He's getting
batteries. So, but I think you're talking about a very deep recession to want to get into that. You're talking about 2020, you're talking about 2008. You're not talking about a normal everyday thing. Whether the federal government want to do more stuff on that, I don't have any opinion on that. Oh, we're back. That was pretty good. Okay, other questions? Yeah, in the back.
Just curious your thoughts on tariffs. They're starting to roll out, and how long it's going to take to see what the true impacts are. I mean, we're starting to see them in contracts with suppliers or firms where they're getting stuff that they know they're going to be taxed, kind of these, like, I'll call it tariff clauses in contracts. And are consumers going to stop spending because the costs are going to be passed ultimately down to them or businesses? Just kind of general thoughts on how you think that may play out, how long it's going to take to see the impact.
Yeah. So, no? Hello? So tariffs. Let's start just, really practically, which is there's some importer somewhere, let's say China, who is sending something into the country, and there's now a 30% charge on that. So you're an importer. Maybe you're Home Depot or maybe you're a manufacturer. The first thing you do is you try to have them bear some of it. And we are seeing places like Japan Autos where the local manufacturer is bearing it. But it's a negotiation. So maybe that 30 goes to 25. If you don't like the 25, your next thing is to say, what alternatives do I have? And maybe you'll move it to another country where it's cheaper, or maybe another supplier even in the US, and you save some money. So maybe that 25 goes to 22. Okay. Don't forget that the tariff rates have taken a long time to settle. I mentioned 17% announced, 9 actual. There's a lot of confusion in the ports about what actually is there. There's a lot of companies that pre-ordered and have lots of stuff in inventory or have transshipped to get things out. So the numbers that you hear are not as big as the numbers in fact, in part because they're worked down. But in the end, there's some number that is coming to and being paid by American importers or companies. Let's just call that, I said 9%. That's what's coming. Now, then you go to Home Depot and you say, all right, I'm passing that on to you. And Home Depot says, not so fast. I need to validate that. I need to make sure that number's right. And by the way, you never pass things on for 90 days. And by the way, we should share some of that. And so all of those negotiations are going on. And then after they all go on, Home Depot has to decide, do I increase my prices to the consumer or do I bear part of that? So all of that is happening in the chain. And the people that I talk to tell me that those people who have received tariff charges are absolutely passing it on, but you got to deal with Home Depot, you got to deal with Lowe's, you got to deal with Walmart, and you got to, in the end, decide whether you're going to put that price in front of the customer. And then, as I said in my speech, the customer doesn't have to take it. And if you go into Home Depot to buy a ladder and the ladder price is more than you want to pay, you might not buy the ladder, or you might buy a different ladder, or you might go to somebody, you might buy a used ladder from somebody else. Okay. Hopefully you guys heard the first part of it. And Milton Friedman, if he were talking about it, would say you can't really have inflation sustained if you don't have more money in the system. And what I'm talking about is kind of a cousin of that. If consumers are stretched but you absolutely need the ladder because something's on your roof, then you don't have any more money, you'll buy less of something else. And so the net on inflation, I think the tariff impact on a tariffed good is going to absolutely hit the customer in places at percentages. It's fine, I like to talk. It's absolutely going to hit, but I think nowhere near as big as people are making it out to be, and a lot slower than people are making it out to be, because of all of these supply chain things I'm talking about as people, sort of work through it. But it is going to hit, but it's just going to hit in a much more diffused way. I also think that the customers are the ultimate enforcer of that. And so, again, as I said, if you just take yourself back to 2022 and you reflect on your attitude when you went to get a haircut and the barber had increased the prices or whatever, versus your attitude today, I think it's different. I think it's different for all of us. We've been through this inflation thing. We hated inflation. We didn't have the, I'll call it, capacity to deal with all of it at once back in 22. And for many of us, we had more money in 22. And we just sort of said, screw it, I'll pay it. I don't know that that's happening now. And I think that's going to keep some amount of a lid on it. That doesn't mean, zero. I think it's impossible to imagine zero. I also don't believe it's all going to go through, if that makes sense. Yeah?
In regards to the housing market, when we're looking at potentially balanced market here, buyers and sellers, properties are still selling, are there things that the Fed tracks that might trigger an interest rate cut or consideration, something like that? If houses are still selling, buyers are still buying, sellers are still selling for reasonable amounts, we're not seeing a recession, are there things you might look at before you decide to make a decision on rates?
So we track the housing market carefully. We don't track it because, it's very important to us that you get the mortgage that you want at the price you want, though you are very important to us. We track it because residential construction is a big part of the economy. Interestingly, residential construction has been relatively healthy over the last few years because we're so short houses that the big home builders are building. But the transaction volume, if you want to think about that, that's not the big indicator. The GDP is, new houses, people paying construction workers, people buying materials and windows and doors and washing machines and all that kind of stuff. So, that's what we're watching. There's no question that the housing market's been gummed up, over the last few years. We underbuilt housing for a generation. We didn't notice it because millennials didn't want to buy a house. Then COVID happened. Many of us were stuck in our house 24 hours a day. We learned two things. One was we didn't like our house. The second was we didn't like our roommate. And so you got a lot more demand for housing, and we didn't have any more supply. And then it was hard to get supply because, of all the supply chain issues. Also because a lot of the construction people were building roads or building data centers or building warehouses. And so supply just hasn't kept up with demand. That's why prices are up. That's sort of basic stuff. The answer has got to be build more houses. We're not going to solve the stuck housing market by lowering rates in order to increase the number of people who want to buy houses. That's only going to increase the price of houses. You see what I mean? So we've got to just build supply. And there are a lot of places, I talked about how much I drive around, but I do think of myself as a windshield warrior. And, as you look out the windshield, I can tell you, if you drive up and down 95 in North Carolina, they're building a lot of houses. If you drive I-40 north of Charlotte or 77 north of Charlotte, they're building a lot of houses. If you go around Richmond, they're building a lot of houses. And I know you guys are doing some stuff here as well, but the answer has got to be more supply. That's how you bring supply and demand more into balance. And initiatives that local governments can do to attract and incent developers, initiatives that states can do to put excess land in the market to try to attract and incent, that's where the leverage is here. You had a question?
I'm just curious, if you were to look back on your career, how often does theory match up with reality? And how many times does the Fed do something and get a reaction or a response that's different from what they thought?
Luckily, I've only been at the Fed 7.5 years, so even I ought to be able to remember that. If you say, look at my 40-year career and say, how often does theory match reality? I would agree with you, which is not that often. So a good way to think about this is to say, if you designed the world's best artificial intelligence model of the US economy, how confident would you be in it? And the answer is not very confident, because it's an awfully difficult thing to try to model out, which is why all your financial professionals I'm interested in. But I mean, things come in from left field, COVID being the most recent big example. When you look at the theorists and say, how do interest rates affect demand? They'll talk about it, we have models, they do this, and it's with a lag. You go, oh, how long's the lag? And they'll say 6 months to 24 months. I go, well, how is that helpful to me, right? And so, I like to think one of my roles on the committee is as being someone who has actually sold something, hired people, fired people, priced things, to call into question how good the models are. Now, directionally, they're not wrong. I mean, it is not wrong that if you raise interest rates, you restrain the economy. It is not wrong that if you lower rates, but to actually try to model out how that works. The most recent example of that was the word transitory, which we all know is a dirty word. But coming out of COVID, right, it looked like all of the price increases were in new and used cars. They'd had chip problems. And air travel, car rentals, and hotels, they'd closed down because of the pandemic. So don't get too fussed about that. I mean, it's going to go away. And of course, it didn't. Now, nobody modeled the Ukraine war, so that kind of hurt. And nobody modeled that inflation. So that same thing today. We have tariffs. I've just said, it will clearly impact some prices in some places, some amount, but how much? I mean, that's where judgment has to come in and where models have to go. So I agree with your premise. You can't just depend on theory. You also can't ignore basic forces, and you sort of try to navigate your way in there. I should also say, sometimes when the difficulty of what you described sort of flows up in my head, I go, in the end, the world isn't going to go to hell or based on 25 basis points. It's just not. So you don't have to make all of the decisions at once. You don't have to go, all right, tomorrow I'm going to increase 300 basis points or shrink 400 basis points. You just have to do it a little bit at a time and then see and adjust. And I think that I think lowers the cost of error in a way that I think is helpful. Yeah?
Yeah, so you began by saying this all lies at the feet of the consumer. So it's sort of, it opened with a lean demand side of the economy. And this last discussion of housing, I started hearing this more of the supply side discussion. You guys raising demand and helping the problem. Is there anything else, and forgive my ignorance, that the Fed can be doing to help supply side solutions to this economic situation we're in? This one of the issues being, of course, we discussed workforce and that supply and increasing. So anything else the Fed can do?
Yeah, not a ton. We do oversee and regulate the banks. And so to the extent that, with appropriate safety and soundness, we encourage the banks to, be lending to people with good credit. I think that helps unlock some of the supply side of the economy. So there's a place. You don't want to go overboard on that, because that then shuts down the supply side of the economy, as we learned in 2008. But I think, thinking about appropriately metering and tailoring regulation to what's needed and not going too far, that's a place we can do it. In monetary policy, like I said, and I mean, we raise rates 25 basis points, we lower them 25 basis points. That's not supply side. There's a ton to be done on the supply side, and I think, on the table, right? Workforce growth is a huge element on the supply side that makes a massive difference. Productivity, getting more output out of the assets we've got. That's another part of the supply side. And to the extent that appropriately crafted deregulation can help unlock productivity, that's a huge upside. We don't do that, but I mean, that can be done by state and local governments and regulators, and federal government too, obviously. Things that get us more access to capabilities we wanted. I mean, who knew, back to the models, who knew in 2021 that we were dependent on chips from Taiwan to get our cars in dealer lots? I didn't know that in 2021. But if there's issues with the security of our supply chain and getting the security of our supply chain so that our manufacturers can actually manufacture when things go south, that's a huge thing. So all those things are huge supply side vehicles. And again, I think there's a ton of leverage on the supply side. I'm not suggesting otherwise. I'm just saying you've also got to get, if people aren't going to buy it, yeah. Good. Others? All right. As always, I really appreciate the chance to be with you. Thanks for your questions, your thoughts. And we'll stay a bit afterwards if people have things going on in their businesses we should hear about. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. That was a wonderful presentation. As always, we have a small thank you gift from the chamber. I have a friendly reminder. On August 28th, we have a speed networking event at the Co-work in Blacksburg. And we want to thank everyone who contributed to swag bags for Montgomery County teachers. We had 135 bags this year. Our next Eggs and Issues program is September 18th, starting at 8 a.m., and the topic will be mental health and wellness. So we hope you all come for that. So thank you to our sponsor, Freedom First, and thank you all for joining us. I hope you all have a great day.